I want to introduce Trevor more fully. As I said, he's a lecturer here in the Department of Management, Science, and Engineering at Stanford, and he teaches a graduate level course titled Entrepreneurial Management and Finance, which we're going to talk about. He's also the managing partner and founder at Flywheel Ventures and has over 20 years of experience investing, 20 years of experience in entrepreneurial and operating experience in technology ventures. He's also the past director of the National Venture Capital Association, co-founder of the New Mexico Venture Capital Association, helped create the Rocky Mountain Venture Capital Association. So a lot of experience there. I also want to add that he is also a former student of SIGO as well. So he also did his master's degree here at Stanford while he was working, so on a part-time and online basis. And so we will talk a little bit about his experience as an online student, how that's influenced the way he runs this class, and why he likes to have professional students join and be part of it remotely, and how that's influenced his professional life beyond his teaching and his philosophy. So with that, Trevor, I gave a kind of high-level background, but I think the place to start maybe is just hearing more about what your background and your kind of professional journey. Maybe we can start as an engineer all the way to being the managing partner. And let's just start there. Hear a little bit more about your background.
Great. Well, thanks, Pax. And it's great to be here with everyone. I hope wherever you are in the country or the world that things are going well. It's certainly a period of more change and uncertainty than we've seen in a while. And that lends itself to the startup experience and what our course is about, which is a lot to do with managing all of the various uncertainties and decisions and dilemmas that you encounter in building a startup. And obviously, we'll talk more about that here in a minute. To answer your question, Pax, there's sort of one common thread of three different things that I do in parallel. The three things I do in parallel are run a venture capital firm that I founded 25 years ago and still invest out of, building startups, sitting on boards, all the whole soup to nuts gamut. I also teach, and I've been teaching this course for almost 15 years now, and been teaching at Stanford, and I helped build the Entrepreneurship Center in the engineering school, more than 25 years ago now. And I also do a lot of policy work around the globe with governments and universities and other organizations, helping to build entrepreneurial ecosystems. And that's really the thread that binds all three of those things together. I'm interested in the entrepreneurial experience at the actual level of a startup company, and also at the level of helping people start venture capital firms to support entrepreneurs, and then at the level of policy, helping people build new emerging startup ecosystems around the world. And that's sort of been the common thread for all of my experience, at least in the last 20, 25 years. Happy to then kind of back up if you'd like and sort of talk about how I got there, but anything you want me to weigh in on first on that high level intro?
No, that's wonderful. And I do want to circle back to all three of those things and how that comes back to, obviously the teaching is, as you said, an important part of that. You're both running companies at the individual level, helping train or teach people how to do that through your teaching, but you're also thinking about the larger ecosystems, the systems that enable and empower people to create those kind of entrepreneurial organizations. I would love to I do want to come back to them. I want that to be the focus, but I also know that before you were a venture, before you founded Flywheel Ventures, that you had also essentially been an engineer. You had been a manager. Could you talk a little bit about that experience and what drove you to make that switch to being a managing partner? Where, for many of us, we don't want to make that switch. So what prompted you to do that?
Yeah. Well, so if we go all the way back to the age of the dinosaurs, when I was an undergraduate student at Stanford as well. My undergrad degree was a bachelor's in electrical engineering with a focus on semiconductor physics. And I started my career once I graduated at Intel. Back in really the heyday, back when Intel was like NVIDIA is today, the sort of dominant chip maker, growing, like a rocket ship and just trying to keep up. And I did a couple of things while I was at Intel. I worked on actual chip design, contributed to the first Pentium and then the follow-on Pentium 2 generation of chips. But after a couple of years of doing that, it became clear to me, and I suppose to some other folks, that while I was a perfectly decent engineer and fine at sort of implementing microprocessor designs, I had a little bit more of an interest and a talent for bringing teams of engineers together and sort of leading them in the process of shipping products and getting them out the door. And so that led me to a series of entrepreneurial experiences, three startups in particular, one in the chip industry, one in the wireless systems industry, and then one obligatory .com startup in the digital music space. And of those three, I had sort of one IPO, one M&A, and one failure. And as I sometimes joke, but it's really true, most of what I feel like I learned about entrepreneurship, I learned from the failure. We can talk more about that. That's a topic we actually talk about quite a bit in this course that I teach. Then I actually, as you mentioned, while I was still working, I started a dual master's program in electrical engineering and the management science and engineering department where I now teach. And I did the first half of that. So probably 2 or 3 years I did classes remotely. I was going to say online, but this predates the internet was just in the formation. And so that was back when you guys would record lectures and ship them to me on a VHS tape. And then I would complete the homework and I would fax it back to my professors. So we've come a long way in our ability to interact in real time since then. But that really does lay the groundwork for my interest in involving students who are still working and who can participate remotely. And I know we'll talk more about that and how that is implemented in our course here in a minute. When I came back then to do the second half of those 2 degrees on campus, that's when I had the opportunity to work with a professor named Tom Byers and build something called the Stanford Technology Ventures Program, which is the entrepreneurship center in Stanford's School of Engineering. And somewhat controversial idea back in those days that we should be teaching entrepreneurial management and finance and all kinds of startup stuff to technical students and not only to the business students. Obviously, in the 25, 30 years since we started that, the wisdom of doing that has been validated many times over, not just at Stanford, but now around the world at lots of universities. And as a technical person myself, who then entered the entrepreneurial world, I just believe very strongly that exposing entrepreneurial thinking and principles to people with technical backgrounds just has a wonderful impact, both individually on those people, but also collectively on the kinds of products and solutions that get brought into the world as a result.
That's fantastic. I want to kind of maybe dive in a little bit more on 2 of those things, which is the first, I do want to talk about the failure and how much you learned from that. And this is a thing, I've had a couple of these conversations recently in similar sessions, and this idea of learning from your failures and not just what you did wrong, but from what I understand, the kind of the emotion of it, right? I mean, it's incredibly emotionally draining to go through something like that. And it's an important lesson for anybody and for entrepreneurs. So let's start there. And then I do want to come back also to this idea of why it's important to teach technical students a little bit about the entrepreneurial mindset. So maybe start with this idea of the failure and why you learned so much from it. And we can already begin talking about the class, how you think about that and integrate it into the class as well.
Okay, sure. Yeah. The entrepreneurial journey, and when I say that, let me just clarify, and we'll come back to this also, I'm sure. We're not just talking about starting companies. I believe entrepreneurship is much broader than starting businesses. It's a form really of leadership. It's a leadership style that starts with opportunity first instead of resource constraints, and assumes that first you figure out what the right opportunity is to pursue, and then you'll be able to go assemble the team and the financing that you need to actually go execute on that plan. And our course is really about the back half of that. It's how do you pull together the team and how do you pull together the financing and what's the interaction of those two. So on the failure standpoint, one of my observations is, again, whether you're in a startup company or some other form of entrepreneurial organization, or even in a big company or government, entrepreneurial leadership is really about this opportunity-focused way of leading first. And that requires a tremendous amount of uncertainty, a tremendous amount of iteration, because by definition, you kind of have this sense of what the opportunity is, but you don't know what the solution's going to be. And nonetheless, you start out anyway. You sort of, the cliche is you build the plane while you're already on the runway or even in the air. What people sometimes don't talk enough about, lots of accelerators and courses and speakers and you can get on podcasts and universities or whatnot, they talk about a lot of the tactical aspects of that. What I find still doesn't get talked about enough is the actual human experience, the psychological and emotional journey that involves, and the stress that you're under, particularly amidst all that uncertainty and your responsibility for the team that you've put together and your responsibility for making sure that there's money in the bank to pay them. And one of the reasons why I believe failure is such a great teacher is when things don't work and you've been under that stress, it actually opens you up a little bit more as a human being to really think hard about what led you to things not working, et cetera. When you go down an entrepreneurial path and everything kinds of really more or less works out well, there tends to be a revisionist history in that you kind of forget that you had all that suffering and pain and that you made a bunch of mistakes along the way. And it's just how we're wired as humans. I'm not a psychologist, but my experience is it's really easy to just adopt a persona of someone who's become successful. And actually you lose access to all that knowledge that you gained and was available to you. But when you fail, you can't escape that. And so it forces you to embrace everything that you learned. And that actually makes you a stronger human, but also a stronger leader. And in my opinion, a better entrepreneur eventually. And that's why so many successful entrepreneurs you hear from talk about some experience of failure they had along the way toward eventually reaching success and how pivotal that failure stage was for them.
That's great. So, kind of to say back what I'm hearing is a sense that failure teaches you humility, and humility teaches you self-reflection, and that allows you to become a better leader, a better entrepreneur, a better business person.
That's right. I think it's reflection and absorption.
Reflection. Okay.
It's when you're successful, it's really easy to just dismiss the lessons that you should be learning because you sort of assume that everything you did worked out, and failure faces you straight in the eye and doesn't let you avoid it. And that's valuable.
And is that something, obviously in a class, I don't know if you simulate failure, but I'm assuming even if you did, it won't have that kind of emotional resonance that you would have having worked on something over years. But how do you introduce that when you're teaching entrepreneurs, or even when you're thinking about policy? I mean, that's probably if you probably want to encourage a policy or an ecosystem that allows people to take risks, allows and expects failure, a certain amount of failure, because if you don't have failure, maybe you're not trying big enough ideas, but does so in a way that maybe provides a safety net or some resilience within the system. So can you talk about how that works into both that kind of classroom and maybe or coaching experience, as well as that policy piece that you work on?
Yeah, I'll take those kind of in reverse order. I think on the policy front, that is the hardest place. The incentive structure in most policymaking environments is set up to punish failure quite aggressively and actually not to reward success all that much, especially at least in the US and other similar policymaking environments. The people making the policy decisions almost never have a longevity of their position that they're in, where they'll still be around by the time the outcome becomes clear either way. And as a result, they're very sensitive to what it looks like is happening in the first year or two. Whereas, we know the average company from seed financing to a successful exit for companies that succeed is about 9 years now. which, by the way, is more than double what it was when I started my career. And if you look at ecosystems, an ecosystem emerging is at least generational and often 2 generations before you really get critical mass. And so it takes a rare kind of person involved in the policy front who has that kind of long-term commitment and who frankly has some source of financing or power or influence where they can stick around and help shepherd for 2 decades or more. And that's one of the biggest challenges in that environment. For the class, one of the things we try to do, our class is very experiential. There's obviously the traditional readings and videos and things we ask people to read before class. Every week we have a case study that is the primary form in which we teach the class and experience it. And in addition, most weeks we have some form of interactive exercise inside the class as well. Each class is 3 hours long, so we have plenty of real estate to both have the case discussion and then do some kind of role play. And the reason why we do so much in this experiential way is we are trying to expose our students to all these different common dilemmas that they're going to face in the entrepreneurial journey, whether that's from the beginning, picking co-founders and deciding how you're going to divide the initial equity, to how to negotiate with your first employees, how to negotiate financing with angels or VCs, all the way until figuring out maybe when it's time for you as a founder who's been the CEO to step aside and bring in somebody new, and how to see that as growth and opportunity and not as a failure. And we try to create all of these role plays so that the students can experience at least a tiny little bit of what it actually feels like to be in that situation. We have mock board meetings, we have mock negotiations over term sheets. And we will teach, and students will learn specific parts of a term sheet and how to model a cap table and how to think about unit economics in their business model. But ultimately, the real goal at the higher level of the class is for students to remember what it felt like for a moment to be trying to figure out how to do that negotiation so that they can draw on that expertise, and it's just slightly less of a mystery when they encounter it in real life.
That makes a lot of sense. So just the experiential part, the role playing is a crucial piece of just simulating and getting students to experience that, as you said, emotionally, right? Understanding that emotional valence, obviously different in a class than when you're doing it as an entrepreneur, but it's important to have that exposure.
Well, and it's precisely that you can fail at that exercise in our class, and there's really no downside to it. I should note that we almost never grade those exercises to the extent that they're grading, or homework assigned related to those. We tend to assign a reflection exercise where the deliverable is what you learned from doing the role play, whether it worked or not, whether you could negotiate a deal or not, whether you and your mock co-founders could come to an agreement or not, whether in a board meeting the CEO was fired by the board or not, all these kinds of things. We ask you to then reflect on what you learned and what you do differently and how you'd advise somebody else going through that. And then the only part that's graded is that reflection. So it creates an environment where you can experiment with taking different positions. You can negotiate really aggressively. You can try to be a team builder and build collaboration first. And there are different ways to do it. And we like to let students explore different approaches. And again, the stakes in the course are next to non-existent. So rather see you fail now and learn from that a little bit, and then move forward and implement that in your life.
That's really interesting. And just one thing that I think of is just, whenever you're in those experiences and sort of outside of a simulation, you tend to fall back on what you're most comfortable with. And you don't have that. You don't feel comfortable or to take the risk to experiment with, say, a more aggressive approach if you're more conciliatory, or if you tend to be aggressive, trying to do the consensus building. And what sounds really interesting is allow people to not just play different roles, but explore different personalities and how you approach those different problems. I could see that as being really, really valuable as a learning experience to individuals and students. So, yeah.
Well, the other piece that I think comes into play with that sort of accompanies that, we do teach the basic concepts and structures. So you'll build cap tables for companies. You'll fill out term sheets. you'll model the impact of different terms in a term sheet on what's called the waterfall, which is calculations of what the actual payout to different employees or founders or investors will be based on how you negotiate a term sheet, et cetera. And again, 10 years later, you may not remember exactly what the difference was between a participating liquidation preference and non-participating. But what I hope you'll remember is, the principle that was at stake, the idea that if you don't pay attention to some of these details, you can find that you assumed that the payout would be a function of who owned what percentage of the company. And in reality, investors have lots of little creative ways to change so that they get paid out more than what you would think that they would. And if you don't know about that and you don't have good advisors to remind you of that, it can sneak up on you. So ultimately, the more quantitative part of the course, there is some spreadsheet work and some calculations of various things or whatnot, and that's really aimed at demystifying all of these concepts. And no one of them are actually rocket science. We're not doing linear algebra, or machine learning. We're just using Excel and doing basic math. But most of the time, the terminology that the venture industry throws around, and like any profession, there's often more complexity with the terminology than actually needs to be the case. And that's in part probably purposeful because it makes entrepreneurs feel a little bit more on the back of their heels. Like, it's more complicated than it actually is. And so the other goal of our class is you come out of it having demystified all these things that you thought were complicated, and now you've done them and you realize they're not complicated. They're maybe the human negotiation part is, but the actual underlying concepts are pretty straightforward. And hopefully then when you go forward, you're not intimidated by that part of it, and whether you're at a startup or on the investment side or anything else.
That's great. And maybe one other thing that you're saying there is, as you mentioned, these, a company can go, it's 9 years from seed to exit, and you allow, you kind of compress that so you can see in the short period of time, this is what you negotiated, this is what it will be 9 years later. And so it allows you to see that feedback loop, which is, a 9-year feedback loop is not one that's easy to learn from necessarily. And so
9 years and 10 weeks. So it's about a week a year, a year a week. The other thing I'd mention about the class packs is almost every week we have a guest speaker who joins and really leads a major part, if not most of the discussion. And all of our guest speakers are both highly successful, experienced professionals. Some of them are startup founders. Our first week, it's Josh Reeves, who's the founder of and still runs the CEO of Gusto, which is a $10 billion, what we call a decacorn now. And is a Stanford engineering graduate himself. Then we have, top tier venture capital investors. We also have experienced Silicon Valley lawyers, particularly for the term sheet stuff, and they help advise the students on how that works in the real world, et cetera. So there's a heavy piece of practitioners' involvement, but I would also emphasize, while all of these people are big names in their fields, they're chosen because they're great teachers. The focus of this course is on the students and the experience that the students are having. And my job as the instructor working with the guests each week is to curate an experience that the students will go through so that they encounter these dilemmas and these decisions and these feelings and these terms on their own, again, about a year a week, so that when they come through it, they've at least touched the surface of what it felt like to be in that position.
That's great. I want to maybe take a step back from the class itself and come back to something you said earlier, which is related to the class, which is this idea of, back when you started both the technology, I think the entrepreneurship program within the School of Engineering and this class, that it was unusual to want to take the kind of business mindset and teach it to technical students, to engineers. I'm curious if you want to expand on that, but other things that you have been seeing that have changed across the ecosystem in those 20, 25 years that you've been teaching, that you've been practicing as a managing partner. So let's start there. And then there are a few that I know you've worked on that I would love to bring up as well if they don't come up initially.
Okay. Yeah. So At the time when Tom and I were first rolling out this program, the general view across universities was that entrepreneurship was a skill that was appropriate as part of a business school MBA type curriculum, in the same way that you might specialize in an MBA in accounting and you'd learn the whole skill set around accounting. And our view was quite different, which is that entrepreneurship is less a skill and it's much more a mindset. And so although there are practical examples that I was just, giving examples of in the class of specific, very tactical situations that you encounter in building a high growth startup, um, uh, we don't necessarily view that as the only expression that's relevant. And again, we believe entrepreneurship is a 21st century leadership style that's appropriate across all kinds of domains, whether it's business or nonprofits or government, or there's even a former student who's now a priest who tells me about how he uses his entrepreneurial thinking to change some things about how he goes about delivering, faith-based teaching. So there are all kinds of domains in which this stuff can kind of come into play. And so with that spin on it, our feeling is what we're trying to do is expose people to this leadership mindset and then have them apply that to some skill-based area that happens to be their specialty. That could be a chemical engineering, that could be a mechanical engineer, it could be machine learning. It could be, we sometimes have medical students or law students. We actually believe that when you have a core expertise that's about what you know how to do, then you apply this leadership mentality on top of that. It creates what we call T-shaped people, where the vertical part of the T is this deep expertise and the broad top of the T is this leadership mindset. That is what we really try to teach throughout all the courses in the engineering school at Stanford. So that's kind of where we started. And then your question about, what's changed over those years. There are two things. One is within universities in particular and education more broadly, the idea now that people with deeper expertise should be exposed to entrepreneurship as a leadership approach has gained a lot more, that's widely accepted now. Not every single place, but mostly across kind of top tier research universities at least. And what's really exciting is we have seen it now move outside of just technical students. And, there are arts schools now that teach entrepreneurship, because if you think about it, artists are actually more likely to become entrepreneurs than engineers, because there's no big Google company you work for if you're an artist. Artists are much more likely to have to build a career on their own. And so it's been really exciting to see entrepreneurship spread in all kinds of different disciplines. The other biggest change I've seen, which is more in the real world, is a shift in the power dynamic. When I started both building the program at Stanford, and then after that when I started my venture capital firm, the power dynamic was very tilted in favor of venture capitalists and angel investors, the people with the money. And that was partly because there was a scarcer pool of capital to fund early stage ventures. But a lot of it was the lack of access to information for entrepreneurs. There wasn't social media. There wasn't yet blogging by VCs or founders. There certainly weren't things like Y Combinator, Techstars, or other programs. So there was almost no way for a founder to learn about how all this worked unless they just happened to have another founder that they were friends with who had already been through it. It was very much an apprentice type approach. And that let a lot of investors, unfortunately, take advantage of entrepreneurs. And the best thing that's happened in the last 20, 25 years is almost a complete inversion of that dynamic, at least in any established startup ecosystem, where it's understood now that the truly scarce resource are talented founders and the opportunities that they're passionate about solving. And the capital is more like, not quite a commodity, because I think there are certain things that investors still bring to the table, but it's the view of professional and I think successful investors today is and should be much more that we are just service providers and we happen to supply capital in the same way that a lawyer provides you with legal advice or your audit firm, does your audit in your books. And that shift in the power dynamic is another thing that we look at a lot in the course, because again, our course looks at both the financial incentives that are created by how you finance a business and the implications of that on the management culture you're trying to build. And those two things have a sort of codependent effect on each other. And well, we can talk more about that, but I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, you know, that's really interesting. And I wonder if you could talk, maybe if you've seen another shift in, I don't know if power dynamic is the right word, but I'll just say kind of the geographic distribution and how you're seeing companies develop. I know that's something you've worked on, although you spend a lot of time here in the Bay Area and at Stanford. You're also traveling around the globe, as you said, trying to do this policy work, build other ecosystems. And that's something you've been working on long before kind of the pandemic shifted to this huge shift to work from home and changes in just where people are living and working. So I'd love to hear you say a few words about what you were seeing back then, which was only like 6, 7 years ago, or maybe longer ago, and then if you've seen that play out a little bit or accelerated in recent years.
Yeah. It starts with the observation, and these are not my original words, but I honestly can't remember where I first heard this, but the observation that talent is equally distributed geographically, but opportunity is not. There are smart people in great universities all over the world, and there are smart founders coming out of those universities either right after school or after, more commonly actually after they've been in industry working for 5 or 10 years, which is why we think it's so appropriate to involve professional students in the class. And yet historically, the capital was very centralized in Silicon Valley and just a handful of other places really around the world. And what's changed, obviously, Silicon Valley is still the dominant location, but and it has continued to grow. So the amount of investment that happens in Silicon Valley has continued to grow quite nicely in that time. But in parallel, there are just a lot more places around the globe now where there is a functioning, successful, startup ecosystem, whether that's places in Europe or Southeast Asia or China, and then increasingly, in the Middle East, which is where I've probably been spending a lot of my global time in more recent years. And I just think that's really exciting because people should have access to this mindset and this ability to build companies to solve problems, based on the knowledge they have of the regions that they're from or they've grown up in, et cetera. I also think what's exciting is we've seen a lot of international students from Stanford take what they learned both here, and maybe they worked in Silicon Valley for a few years, but increasingly they're moving back to where they're from, and they're helping to transform the economy in those places. And I just love being a part of that. It's very rewarding to watch an ecosystem sort of unfold after 10 or 15 years of that kind of work.
It's interesting. I mean, linking it back to your idea of the T-shaped individual, where the kind of leadership mindset on top, and then this deep expertise. Well, part of that expertise is cultural, local, right? A local expertise that you can bring to solving problems. Through this.
In fact, one of the big, so if anyone knows the famous Tolstoy novel Anna Karenina, which has a very famous first line that happy families are all alike and unhappy families are different and all in their own ways. And I sort of invert that for startup ecosystems, that all unsuccessful startup ecosystems are alike. And that's because they all try to copy Silicon Valley and just import it. And all successful startup ecosystems are different in their own way because they're all built around something unique about the culture or the skill set or the industry clusters in that region. And the leaders who cultivate those ecosystems have to be confident enough to take from Silicon Valley the lessons that are appropriate, but build it around a regional or a local context. And a lot of the work I do with policymakers is trying to convince them to have the courage to do that, rather than just sort of, let's build Stanford at our place and it will magically recreate a Silicon Valley, which never works.
That's interesting. Well, and it comes back to this idea of maybe looking with an opportunity as opposed to a resource constraint lens, right? If you're
Exactly.
trying to take the constraints that exist in Silicon Valley, you're taking a resource constraint approach to recreating it. Whereas you're taking the opportunity approach. You're saying, what is here where I'm working that I can utilize to create something that can be successful?
Yeah, and just to tie this back to the class a little bit, one of the things, we do have some international case studies of startups in other countries we look at, both in terms of raising money and in terms of scaling and how do you build a team in those places, et cetera. I know you also had a question kind of more about the distributed remote, so we can come back to that, but I'll stop there and let you take the conversation where you want to go.
Yeah, and I want to encourage anybody who's joining, you're always welcome to submit questions. We're monitoring that, and we'll get to as many as we can. But feel free, there's a little chat box or Q&A box right there that you should be able to just type a question in if you have something for Trevor about the course, about his experience. But I think maybe coming back to that piece, and then I do want to turn to the course in a little bit more detail. You've already given us a lot of details about it, but I'd like to hear, have a little bit more about kind of the structure and the day-to-day. But before we do that, because it applies to having remote students in the class, and it was reflected in your own experiences working again at Intel. I guess were those the Andy Grove days, or is it still?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So that kind of one of the foundational books of Silicon Valley. I feel like his experience is to what's it called, high output management or something.
Yeah, that one and Only the Paranoid Survive is this other one. They're both fantastic. He was an amazing leader, of course. Silicon Valley was he was a little more strict than the culture of Silicon Valley today. We had the 8 a.m. late list. You had to be in your office by 8 a.m. every day. And if you were even 5 minutes late, you had to sign in, and a list of everyone who signed in late went to Andy Grove every day.
Well, that's actually a nice segue into this idea of a distributed workforce. I'm wondering, there's the idea of the ecosystem, but are you, as you're working with founders, especially kind of in the last few years, what are you seeing? Are you still seeing these companies largely local and, I guess you'd say co-located, right, where they're physically meeting at least a few times a week? Or are you seeing more distributed teams? And what are the challenges you see? What are the challenges you see in leading a company with a distributed team? I had another conversation. Again, I'm very lucky to be able to have these conversations with a lot of people, saying one of the big changes this person saw was a product manager, was that as you had more distributed teams, even smaller companies needed to build in a level of process that you tended to only see at bigger companies, because you couldn't have the kind of ad hoc communication that you had in other when you're all there in the same office. So I'd love to hear if you've actually seen that, or if you see these companies still kind of co-located, and what are those challenges the new challenges that you're seeing and you're coaching people through or learning from them as they experience them?
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying, there's this kind of debate that continues to rage, even not just in the business world, but even broader in the cultural and political domain about whether people should be remote still, or whether everyone should be back at work, or whatnot. And I sort of I don't find that conversation very revealing or helpful. My experience, starting about 15 years ago, at least, maybe even a little longer, is that most companies, certainly once they get beyond the first 8 or 10 people, almost every single company has people that are geographically distributed. And that's just because the scarcest resource is talent. And so if you're going after an opportunity and you're trying to be first to solve the problem that's associated with that opportunity, you need the best talent. And you need to be able to find and use that talent wherever it is. And because the talent comes in the form, at least for now, of human beings and not, AI-based humanoid robots, there are certain things that you're just constrained by, because humans have significant others, and they have children, or they have parents who need care, or they have life situations where they need to be in the geographic area where they're at. And so pretty much every company I've invested in for the last 15 years has had employees, at least in multiple locations. A handful of them have been truly fully distributed, where like no one person's in the same place. But I think that got a little oversold. I think most companies have pockets of people in different geographies, and then those pockets of people need to work with other pockets of people. And so to your point that you heard from someone else, which I completely agree is spot on, what it really speaks to is being thoughtful about leadership and about process. And my observation is that even though companies, the companies that have tried to remain where everyone's in the same building, if you don't still put in the same amount of thoughtfulness into your leadership approach and the culture you're building and the processes, and this is something we talk about in week 1 of the class with Josh Reeves. He talks about all of the leadership processes he's had to build and change since it was just him and his 2 co-founders, and now they have, I forget, many tens of thousands of employees. They actually have 3 corporate headquarters, all of which are co-equal. And that's a very deliberate choice on his part to structure the company in that way. And he talks about why. And at the end of the day, it is true that for certain kinds of activities, humans are better doing things if we're all in the same room. But if you just rely on that to happen without putting any process or leadership into it, I often find that whatever advantages would be there from people being in the same place actually are lost, because people just assume that it's organically going to happen just because they happen to be in the same room. And so having from a very early stage to manage an organization that at least has some portion of the workforce not in the same physical location often forces the leadership to be more thoughtful about how the company is going to do things. And that often leads to a more successful company than it would have been, because they had to put those processes in place anyway, and they actually were forced to put them in place sooner. It's a little bit, there's an analog I talk about with companies, startups from emerging markets. Classic example is the Israeli startup community, which is successful precisely, in my view, because it's such a small market. There is no startup in Israel that sort of imagines that its whole, big, eventual goal is to get 80% market share in Israel. Like, that would still be a tiny business. And so if you start a company in Israel, you sort of assume that you've got to figure out global markets from like the second week of the company. And as a result, those companies are very good at competing globally. Whereas you see startups in much bigger markets, like, for example, not to pick out anything in particular, but just to illustrate the point, I see a lot of German startups where the founders are focused on just building a company that has a really large market share in Germany. And that country's economy is large enough that you can build a mid-sized company doing that. And that's why Germany has so many great mid-sized companies. But if you're trying to truly build a world-class international company, that assumption that you don't need to do that for the first 5 or 10 years, because first you're just going to focus on your domestic market, actually prevents you from ever building the skill set or the processes you need to be a global company. So there's kind of the team pace, but also the market focus piece, and those two things kind of go hand in hand, in my view.
That's really interesting. And I just, thinking about my own experience as studs. I've worked in companies where, we're all in the same building, but I never go to the 3rd floor, because you just
right.
never go to the 3rd floor, unless you go to get
right.
coffee, because the coffee machine is broken on your floor. So
one of the early startups I did was in Palo Alto, and because of the constrained office space, we had 2 offices across the street, each on the 2nd floor above a retail establishment. And we had, this was in the days before Wi-Fi, so we literally had Ethernet cables strung across the street, just like power or telephone wires. And so the networks were connected, but man, the number of times that somebody from one side of the street went to the other side of the street, I could probably count on one hand.
That's hilarious. Yeah, sometimes you forget how even small geographical distribution.
Exactly.
Yeah, I know just shifting office space sometimes radically changes the kind of collaborations that you have when even if everyone was in person, you suddenly are sharing the office space with this other team, and you start talking to them a lot more. So it's interesting. I do want to come back. We have maybe 10 minutes left. And I do want to come back into more detail about your class and linking it back to some of your experience. So again, you teach a class usually in the spring, though sometimes in the winter, but it's happening this spring. So it'll start, I think, around April 1st. I'm forgetting the first day of the quarter. This is a course being held at Stanford. It's on campus. It's a credit-bearing course, but it is open through CIGO, the Center for Global and Online Education, to professional learners who are interested in joining the class as non-matriculated students. And just for those of you who are on the call who aren't familiar with that, this is something that Stanford School of Engineering has done in one form or the other for 70 years, right? It's been an important part, which is, the School of Engineering is only 100 years. So 70% of the engineering school's existence has allowed this kind of these kind of professional learners, working professionals, to join credit-bearing classes, earn a Stanford transcript. And the early days, as you said, Trevor, well, even in the earlier days, you had to be co-located as people in the research park who are literally coming on campus for those classes, people at HP or Stanford Research Institute. But this course, entrepreneurial management and finance, is open to non-matriculated students who are interested in joining for this course and taking it as a remote learner. So you've gone through a little bit, and just to walk through a few things, I think one thing that's important for anyone who might be interested in this course to know is it does require you to be real time, right? Either joining over Zoom, streaming, chat. You'll have some kind of interface for students to join real time during the class meeting periods, which is our Thursdays, Pacific time. I think it's 1:30 to 4:20.
Correct. Yep.
And so you will ask people to join. That's different from people who might have taken other classes from us, which you have to follow along on a week-by-week basis, and maybe you're joining office hours real time, but you don't have to join the lecture time. But that's an important part of this class, because as you said, role-playing and experience are a cornerstone of what you're doing to recreate, in part, that emotional, the feeling of it, and to understand the consequences of negotiations and discussions down the line. Can you give us a little bit more detail? Maybe just walk us through. So you've already said on that first day, you have a guest speaker, you have a lot of practitioners, but maybe just taking a step back, if we're doing, as you said, 9 years and 10 weeks, what does that look like? Yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, just to give you a sampling, I don't have this, the syllabus in front of me, but for week one, we focus on culture and scaling, and how to put in place practices to keep your culture intact as you scale. And again, our guest is Josh Reeves, as I mentioned. I think week two is looking at the landscape of the first funding that's available to entrepreneurs when they're just starting. So when it's, and that's the stage as an investor that I focus on, what today would be called seed or even pre-seed. And, sometimes the joke is I like to fund companies with it's 2 people and a dog. And if they don't have a dog, then I'll get them a dog. And so we're really looking at that stage. How do you raise money from angels, from friends and family, from crowdfunding, and starting to think about VCs. But really, we don't talk about VCs until week 4 or 5, because usually VCs don't come in quite that early. With obviously some exceptions. And part of what we're learning in week 2 is we're building a cap table. We're just understanding how do these things actually structured. What does the stock look like? Who gets how much stock? How do you decide that, et cetera? And then, in subsequent weeks, we're just sort of loosely going chronologically. It's not always perfectly in chronological order because of some constraint where a guest speaker had to come in an earlier week than ideally where I'd put them. And so sometimes things are slightly out of order, but in general, we run chronologically. We spend a whole week looking at business models and understanding how to calculate unit economics, project your cash flow, and therefore figure out how much funding you need to scale. And that's really leads us into talking about how to negotiate with venture capitalists, how to raise money from them, what's important, what you should be looking for from VCs, beyond just the capital they can bring. Then we start to look at some of the scaling issues. We have 1 week where we look at scaling in emerging markets, where it isn't Silicon Valley and you can't just find every single talent that you need, down the street. How do you work through that? That leads up to eventually we have this week where we look at board meetings, and we have a simulated board meeting, including the circumstances where it may be time for the founder to step aside. And that's a hard conversation to have. And then negotiating, as I said, an actual financing with a VC for a later stage round, like a Series B or C. And then we do a week where we negotiate an M&A deal for a pharma company. So you're exiting. And then we actually, the very last week of the class, we focus on ethical decision-making, which is a really unique, very interactive discussion. There are no right answers, but where we present the students with 5 to 15 tricky, thorny ethical dilemmas and have them talk about. First, they vote anonymously on what they do. Then they talk about why they chose what they did. And the really fascinating piece is that, you almost always find that students split about between three choices the way you could deal with the situation. They're roughly split about a third each. And it's often quite shocking for people who assumed that the answer that they chose was the obvious right ethical answer, for them to discover that 2/3 of their peers don't agree with that. And that leads to a really kind of way to bring all the different pieces of the class together on that last day. One tactical thing, Pax, before we forget, the class is Thursdays, starting the first week of April, 1:30 to 4:20. As you said, we do require students, including online professional students, to attend in real time. We have a two-way Zoom feed. You'll be able to ask questions. We can ask questions of you. I can even cold call on people if I really need to. I try not to. The very last, that's the first 9 weeks. The very last week, which is the first week of June, it's not, our class meets not on Thursday, but instead on Saturday afternoon. And the reason that just has to do with the university's scheduling. That turns out to be our final exam slot. We don't have a final exam, so instead our final exam is this ethical dilemma discussion I just described that that pulls together. It acts like a final, pulling together of the themes from the class, but it's not in a test form. It's in this interactive format. But we also require people to be able to attend on that Saturday afternoon, again, in real time, albeit remotely, unless because it's not a work day, some people actually do come to that final class just to meet the other students in person and that kind of stuff, but you don't have to. But we do need you to be able to attend in real time.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I do believe I have it as a June 8th and it's June 7th. I have that on the course description. So I'll update that course description. I have
it's whatever that Saturday is. So yeah.
But that's incredibly helpful. And I like I'm curious if you vote again after that discussion, if it changes people's ethical choices. So
yeah, sometimes we do. And sometimes it shifts and sometimes it doesn't. It's pretty fascinating. Humans are interesting creatures.
Yeah. Well, it is very interesting. It's I think well, we don't need to get into it. We're kind of near the end of our time, but I think that's an interesting exercise in this idea of I think they call it sometimes. I think there's one term for it is like pluralistic ignorance. You think something is what everyone is doing, and then when you actually survey them, you find out nope, that's not what everyone's doing. Yeah. And I know it's been in context of sort of epidemiology or like drinking behavior on college campuses. You think it's much more prevalent than it is, and when you realize it isn't, it helps empower people to not to make different decisions because they don't feel.
Well, and it's really important when you are the one who has to make those decisions as a founder or CEO of one of these organizations. But it's also really important for that broader lesson to keep in mind just when you're building a culture and you assume that all your employees must prefer a certain thing, and you're shocked to find that half of them don't want a dog. Even though I offered to get them one, right? So,
yeah, you need to send out that dog or cat person first day.
That's right. That's right.
Well, Trevor, thank you so much for joining us. I want to remind everyone that if you're interested in learning more about the class, there's a link right there. You can enroll in the class right now. There is one other sort of tactical thing to mention is you do need to have an application on file with us that goes to the department. And then you need an additional course application that we link to that Trevor and his team also review. So you can enroll now. There is no penalty for dropping before the quarter begins at the beginning of April. If you drop, you have up to 3 weeks. So if you join that class and you find out, the commitment of being there every Thursday, I think it's again 1:30 to 4:20 or 1 to 4:20, being there every day for that time period is too much. Maybe with your work commitments or your family commitments. You have the first 3 weeks of the quarter to make a decision to drop the course. I believe you are team-based. Is that correct, Trevor, as well?
Yeah, I was going to add that. The other reason why the real-time attendance is so important, and again, I know it's particularly unusual for this audience versus just watching things on, recordings or whatnot, is we do not create separate teams for our remote students. Instead, all the teams, we integrate the remote students into teams with residential students. So if you take the class, you will have teammates who are residential students, and you'll need to find some time during the week outside of class, usually it's some evening, where you might need to work on a homework assignment together with them as a team or whatnot. The reason why we do that is I believe strongly that replicates what people are going to experience in the real world. And so although it's sometimes viewed as an accommodation to make the remote students feel more included. My secret agenda is I actually think it's more important learning for the residential students who maybe have been assuming that they can always just go walk down the dorm and, talk to their teammate, to figure out that they've got to think about process and how they're going to work on a homework assignment with somebody who may be several time zones away.
That's great. Yeah. And so another important kind of piece, another reason why it's important to include remote
That's
students
right.
in the class.
And again, in the class,
yeah.
when we do the role play exercises, we often do those with the teams. So that's why we need the remote students to be there. Otherwise, some of the team that's required to do the exercise wouldn't be there.
And again, that's very helpful to know. And again, a good piece for anyone who might be interested in taking the course. And again, to repeat, it's the same course. You're responsible for the same learning objectives, and you do get a Stanford transcript at the end of it. That's, you're for that period of time, you're enrolled at Stanford. I will say, in addition to that, the course itself is part of several certificates that we offer through the Management Science and Engineering Department. These are graduate certificates that are accredited by our regional accreditor. And so if you're interested, if the class appeals to you and you take the class and then you're interested in learning or doing more, there are other opportunities for you to expand on the lessons you've taken, you've learned in that class through a variety of different learning paths. It can be taking more classes around entrepreneurship, or because we are in the School of Engineering, maybe more analytically driven decision-making classes where you're going in and looking at where you are working at your constraints and optimizing for those constraints. So those kinds of decision-making classes that a lot of people appreciate. Maybe one last thing I'll mention is, Trevor, I believe there is a prerequisite for this class, which is having having some background in accounting. Is that correct? A standard?
Yeah, either a course or if you've used it in work. It's really, it's accounting, the ability to understand financial statements, because we don't spend any time backing up and learn how to do that. We assume you already know what gross margin means, et cetera. We're not doing super intricate arcane accounting. It's pretty basic stuff, but we have had situations where students didn't know what gross margin was coming into the course, and then they end up sort of having to spend a lot of time catching up to terms that we're just throwing around on the assumption that people know them. The other thing that I want to mention is we also expect that you have some proficiency in using spreadsheets, whether that's Excel or Google Sheets or something like that. Most people do, but every once in a while we discover somebody who hasn't used those before. And there is a fair amount of the quantitative part of the work in the class that just works a lot better if you already know your way around those tools. We're not doing pivot tables or anything complicated, but if you have never used those tools before, it can be a little daunting.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Trevor, for joining us today and talking through your experience managing and financing entrepreneurial organizations and talking a little bit more about your course. We hope to see some of you who joined us today or who are watching this as a recording join us in the future or join Trevor's class in the spring. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Pax. Thanks, everyone, for joining.